大家好，讀你聽嘅時間，今日繼續讀 Michael Lewis 嘅 Liar's Poker， 我哋讀到 Chapter 5，A Brotherhood of Hoots。咁上一回咧就講作者啦 Michael Lewis 啦加入咗 Salomon Brothers 之後初期嘅工作經驗啦，咁啊睇到個 trading floor 入面崗位嘅分工啦，有 trader 啦，有 salesman 啦，佢哋之間嘅 tension， 佢哋之間嘅鬥爭啦，咁啊亦都講到啲 traders 係揾好多錢啦，咁啊亦都造成咗佢哋有啲驕傲嘅性格，有陣時甚至要做出啲野蠻啊、粗鄙啊、好無禮嘅行為啦，尤其是係對於新人啦。但係亦都因為佢哋嘅收入咁高咧，而令到呢啲新人咧乜嘢都肯做啊，為求到去41樓呢個 trading floor 咧就乜都肯做，而相反咧喺40樓 equity 嘅 trade 股票嗰啲咧就好慘淡啦，就好需要咧新人加入。但係41樓 trade bond 啊、trade 債券呢啲咧就揾到盤滿缽滿嚇，有咁樣嘅情況喺度。好啦，咁我哋呢一節又睇下個時間繼續推進啦。呢個主角點樣由新人繼續一步一步咁樣成為 Salomon Brothers 其中之一位最重要嘅成員啦。I don't do favors, I accumulate debts. Ancient Sicilian motto. It was January 1985, and Matty Oliver was fresh from Harvard University in the Salomon Brothers training program. The good news was he had landed a Plum job on the mortgage trading desk. The bad news was that for his first full year on the desk, he would be an object of abuse. The senior mortgage traders maintained that abuse led to enlightenment. It purged trainees of pretension and made them realize they were the lowest of all God's creations. The traders were to blame for the awful thing about to happen to Matty Oliver. A couple of traders regularly asked Matty to fetch their lunch. They'd holler at him, "Hey geek, how about some food?" In their less ornery moments, they said, almost politely, "About that time, ain't it, Matty?" There was no need to be polite to Matty because Matty was a slave. There was no need to tell him exactly what to get because, as every trainee knew, mortgage traders ate anything at any time. Just as some people are mean drunks, mortgage traders were mean gluttons. Nothing angered them more than being without food, unless it was being interrupted while they ate. In other words, they were not the sort of hyperthyroid fat people who meekly sip Diet Cokes all day and prompt one to ask, "So how did he get fat? He never eats." Nor were they the sort of jolly fat people, like Ed McMahon, who are loved because they don't threaten anybody. Mortgage traders were the sort of fat people who grunt from the belly and throw their weight around like sumo wrestlers. When asked to find food, a trainee on the mortgage desk simply brought back as much of everything as he could carry. On that fateful January day, the beleaguered Matty climbed the 5 flights of stairs from the trading floor to the cafeteria. It was demeaning to be seen by one's fellow trainees as a total mortgage slave. The other trainees enjoyed the status of almost free men. Matty quickly filled as many plastic trays as he could carry with fries, burgers, cokes, candy, and a couple of dozen chocolate chip cookies, products of a kitchen known throughout Wall Street for the regular warnings it received from the health inspectors of New York City. Then he sneaked past the security guard without paying. Call it a small triumph. Call it an assertion of self. Call it a little cry of freedom from a much abused soul. Or simply call it economical. Dining and dashing was not unusual in the Salomon Brothers cafeteria. Stealing food wasn't Matty's big mistake. His big mistake was to brag to one of the fat traders how he had done it. That afternoon, Matty received a phone call from a man who claimed to work for the Special Projects Division of the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC. This man explained had been granted jurisdiction over Wall Street's cafeterias, and he was investigating reported theft of 3 trays of food from the Salomon Brothers cafeteria. Would Matty know anything about that? "Ha ha ha," said Matty, "very funny." "No," said the officer, "we are very serious. The ethical standards of Wall Street have to be monitored at all levels." Matty chuckled again and hung up. Matty arrived the next morning to find Michael Motara, a Salomon Brothers managing director waiting for him. Mutara was the head of mortgage trading. It was Mutara who had spoken to our training program. Wits on the Salomon trading floor did imitations of Mutara. They ranged from sounding like Marlon Brando in The Godfather to sounding like Marlon Brando in A Streetcar Named Desire. Mutara looked upset. He asked Matty into his office. "Matty, I just got a call from the Special Projects Division of the SEC, and I don't know what to do about it. Is it true that you have been stealing food from a cafeteria?" he asked. Matty nodded. "What were you thinking? I really don't know what is going to happen now. Look, go back to your desk, and I'll get back to you. This is a problem," said Mutara. The rest of the day, Matty looked as frantic as a lottery winner who had lost his ticket. Although he was a young, much-abused trainee trader, he was nevertheless on the verge of big swinging. The American mortgage market was growing faster than any other capital market in the world, making trading mortgages the best job in the firm. As it was the best job in the Salomon Brothers trading floor in 1985, it was also quite possibly the best job on Wall Street since the Salomon trading floor dominated Wall Street. After 2 years of trading at Salomon, a young mortgage trader basked in a steady flow of offers from Merrill Lynch, Bear Stearns, Goldman Sachs, Drexel Burnham, and Morgan Stanley, all of which were desperate to bottle the Salomon Brothers mortgage magic. These offers guaranteed at least $500,000 a year, plus a cut of trading profits. Matty was a first-year trader. By his 4th year, if he were good at his job, he would be making $1 million before taxes. It was a good time and a great place to be 22 years old, and Matty, through luck and effort, had put himself precisely where he wished to be. Now this, busted by the SEC in the cafeteria. How serious could it be? The other mortgage traders watched him fret, allowed him for a day to mull over life's reversals. The next morning, Matty was told to report to Goodfriend's office. Matty had never met John Goodfriend, nor should he have. Goodfriend, one mortgage trader explained to Matty, doesn't fool around with low people. If Goodfriend wished to see him, the theft was scandalous. Goodfriend's office was about 20 yards away from Matty's seat. It was normally empty. In the course of a long and happy career with Salomon, a person might never set foot inside. Bad things happen in the darkness of that office, to people far more able to defend themselves than Matty. Any hope Matty nourished about the reason for the meeting died when he saw Mutara seated beside Goodfriend in the office. Matty entered. Goodfriend went on for some time about how unfunny it was to steal cheeseburgers from the cafeteria. And then he said, "Matthew, I have just concluded a long and painful meeting with the Salomon Brothers Executive Committee, and we've decided," long pause, "to let you stay for now. All I can say now is that there are further issues we need to iron out with the SEC in Washington. We'll be back to you." All a man has in the markets is his word, his honor. The training program heard that message each year from John Goodfriend. As Matty was new to the business, he might even have believed it. In any case, Matty figured his career was ruined. The theft would haunt him for as long as he remained on Wall Street. Whenever the SEC came snooping for insider traders or food snatchers, Matty would be a suspect. He'd have a record. People would whisper his name. When Matty returned to his seat on the mortgage desk, he appeared to have witnessed the end of the world. For the 20 or so other mortgage traders, the sight was too much to bear. They tried to hide their snickers behind their Quotron machines. Matty looked around him, however, and saw not only that everyone was laughing, but that everyone was laughing at him. He had been made the victim of what was known in the department as a goof. It had been Mutara's idea, but Mutara persuaded Goodfriend to lend a touch of credibility to the ruse. Matty had rejected a priori the possibility that such an unlikely prankster as John Goodfriend would play such tricks. "One of the greatest goofs of all time," one mortgage trader shouted. It was once again proved that credulity of trainees knew no bounds. Think of it, the SEC busting people in the cafeteria. Matty failed to see the humor. His face assumed the short-circuit look of someone who has been made to endure a mock execution, and he began to cry. He then bolted from the trading floor and down an elevator. He planned never to come back, yet no one stopped him. Traders were convulsed with laughter. Goodfriend and Mutara roared together in Goodfriend's office. Finally, more out of duty than compassion, a senior mortgage trader named Andy Stone left to find Matty. He felt responsible because Matty was his assigned slave. Stone had always been one of the more humane traders anyway. Stone bought Matty a beer in the lobby of one New York plaza and tried to persuade him that what had happened was a sign people liked him. You had to command a certain amount of respect before you were goofed on. After several hours pacing the streets, Matty decided to return. I can only imagine what went through Matty's mind as he steamed around southern Manhattan. Once he had calmed down, it must have occurred to him that there was no other place to go. He was bound by golden handcuffs to the Salomon Brothers mortgage trading department. The handful of traders who made life miserable for graduates of Harvard completely dominated a third of the bond market. They were perhaps the most profitable corporate employees in America. They alone could teach Matty how he, too, could dominate the market. It wasn't true, as Stone had said, that the traders bothered to be cruel only to the people they liked. They were cruel to everyone. Some of the cruelty, however, wasn't personal but ceremonial. Goofs were a rite of initiation. Anyway, after a year, Matty would be on the other side of the goof. He'd be the trader snickering behind the quotron while some other slave trainee wept. No, there was no finer place to be in January 1985 than the Michael Matara's righteous view, that rich band of brothers, the mortgage traders of Salomon Brothers. 1978 to 1981. Wall Street brings together borrowers of money with lenders. Until the spring of 1978, when Salomon Brothers formed Wall Street's first mortgage security department, the term borrower referred to large corporations and to federal, state, and local governments. It did not include homeowners. The Salomon Brothers partner named Robert Dahl thought this strange. The fast-growing group of borrowers was neither governments nor corporations, but homeowners. From the early 1930s, legislators had created a portfolio of incentives for Americans to borrow money to buy their homes. The most obvious of these was the tax deductibility of mortgage interest payments. The next most obvious was the savings and loan industry. The savings and loan industry made the majority of home loans to average Americans and received layers of government support and protection. The breaks given savings and loans, such as deposit insurance and tax loopholes, indirectly lowered the interest cost on mortgages by lowering the cost of funds to the savings and loans. The savings and loan lobbyists in Washington invoked democracy, the flag, and apple pie when shepherding one of these breaks through Congress. They stood for home ownership, they say, and home ownership was the American way. To stand up in Congress and speak against home ownership would have been as politically astute as to campaign against motherhood. Nudged by a friendly public policy, savings and loans grew, and the volume of outstanding mortgage loans swelled from $55 billion in 1950 to $700 billion in 1976. In January 1980, that figure became $1.2 trillion, and the mortgage market surpassed the combined United States stock market as the largest capital market in the world. Nevertheless, in 1978 on Wall Street, it was flaky to think that home mortgages could be big business. Everything about them seemed small and insignificant, at least to people who routinely advise CEOs and heads of state. The CEOs of home mortgages were savings and loan presidents. The typical savings and loan president was a leader in a tiny community. He was the sort of fellow who sponsored a float in a town parade. That said it all, didn't it? He wore polyester suits, made a 5-figure income, and worked 1-figure hours. He belonged to the Lions or Rotary Club and also to a less formal group known within the thrift industry as the 363 Club. He borrowed money at 3%, lent money at 6%, and arrived on a golf course by 3 in the afternoon. Each year, 4 salesmen who sold bonds to Texas thrifts performed a skit before the Salomon training class. 2 played Salomon salesmen, 2 played the managers of a thrift. The plot ran as follows. The Salomon salesmen enter the thrift just as the thrift managers are leaving, tennis racket in one hand and a bag of golf clubs in the other. The thrift men wear absurd combination of checkered pants and checkered polyester jackets with wide lapels. The Salomon salesmen fawn over the thrift men. They go so far as to admire the lapels on the jacket of one thrift manager. At this, the second thrift manager gets huffy. "You call those doodads lapels? Those tangy things?" he says in a broad Lone Star accent. Lapels ain't lapels unless you can see them from the back. Then he turns around. and sure enough, the lapels jut like wings from his shoulders. The salesman, having schmoozed their client, moved in to finish him off. They recommend that the thrift managers buy $1 billion worth of interest rate swaps. The thrift managers clearly don't know what an interest rate swap is. They look at each other and shrug. One of the salesmen tries to explain. The thriftmen don't want to hear. They want to play golf. But the salesmen have them by the short hairs and won't let go. Just give us $1 billion of them interest rate swaps, so we can be off. The thrift managers finally say, end of skit. That was the sort of person who dealt in home mortgages, a mere sheep rancher next to the hotshot cowboys on Wall Street. The cowboys traded bonds, corporate and government bonds. And when a cowboy traded bonds, he whipped him and drove him. He stood up and shouted across the trading floor, I got 10 million IBM 8.5s to go, and I want these moved out the door now. Never in a million years could he imagine himself shouting, I got the $62,000 home mortgage of Mervyn K. Finkelberger at 101. It has 20 years left on it. He's saying a 9% interest, and it's a nice 3-bedroom affair just outside Norwalk. Goodbye too. A trader couldn't whip and drive a homeowner. The problem was more fundamental than a disdain for middle America. Mortgages were not tradable pieces of paper. They were not bonds. They were loans made by saving banks that were never supposed to leave the saving banks. A single home mortgage was a messy investment for Wall Street, which was used to dealing in bigger numbers. No trader or investor wanted to poke around suburbs to find out whether the homeowners to whom he had just lent money was creditworthy. For the home mortgage to become a bond, it had to be depersonalized. At the very least, a mortgage had to be pooled with other mortgages of other homeowners. Traders and investors would trust statistics to buy into a pool of several thousand mortgage loans made by a savings and loan, of which, by the laws of probability, only a small fraction should default. Pieces of paper could be issued that entitled the bearer to a pro rata share of the cash flows from the pool, a guaranteed slice of fixed pie. There could be millions of pools, each of which held mortgages with particular characteristics, each pool in itself homogeneous. It would hold, for example, home mortgages of less than $110,000 paying an interest rate of 12%. The holder of the piece of paper from the pool would earn 12% a year on his money, plus his share of the prepayments or principal from the homeowners. Thus standardized, the pieces of paper could be sold to an American pension fund, to a Tokyo trust company, to a Swiss bank, to a tax-evading Greek shipping tycoon living in a yacht in the harbor of Monte Carlo, to anyone with money to invest. Thus standardized, the pieces of paper could be traded. All the trader could see was a bond. All the trader wanted to see was the bond. A bond he could whip and drive. A line which would never be crossed could be drawn down the center of the market. On one side would be the homeowner. On the other, investors and traders. The two groups would never meet. This is curious in view of how personal it seems to lend a fellow man the money to buy his home. A homeowner would see only his local savings and loan manager, from whom the money came and to whom it was, over time, returned. Investors and traders would see paper. Bob Dale first became curious about mortgages while working for a Salomon partner named William Simon, who later became Secretary of the U.S. Treasury under Gerald Ford. Simon was supposed to monitor developments in the mortgage market, but as Dale says, he could not have cared less. In the early 1970s, Simon traded United States Treasury bonds for Salomon Brothers. He liked to do this on his feet, drinking jug after jug of ice water. Shouting bids and offers for bonds was not then a fashionable occupation outside Salomon Brothers. When I first came into the business, trading was not a respectable profession, he later told the writer L.J. Davis. I never hired a B-school guy on my desk in my life. I used to tell my traders, if you guys weren't trading bonds, you'd be driving a truck. Don't try to get intellectual in the marketplace. Just trade. Simon was not a Harvard graduate, but a Lafayette College dropout who had elbowed his way to the top. He didn't attract crowds of aspiring traders on his visit to college or business school campuses because there weren't any crowds of aspiring traders. What he said or did was of no interest to the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal. Who in the 1970s cared about treasury bonds? Still, he felt and acted big. Salmon was where opinion mattered, and inside Salmon, the Treasury trader was king. U.S. Treasuries were the benchmark for all bonds. The man who could whip and drive them was the benchmark for all traders. Simon's distaste for the home mortgage market stemmed from a dispute he had with the Government National Mortgage Association in 1970. Ginnie Mae guaranteed the home mortgages of less affluent citizens, thereby imbuing them with the full faith and credit of the U.S. Treasury. Any homeowner who qualified for a Federal Housing and Veterans Administration mortgage received a Ginnie Mae stamp. Ginnie Mae sought to pool its loans and sell them as bonds. Here is where Simon came in. As the advisor to the U.S. government most knowledgeable about bonds, he was the natural man to nurture the mortgage market. Like most mortgages, Ginnie Mae-backed loans required a gradual repayment of principal over time. Also, like most mortgages, the loan could be prepaid in full at any time. This was the crippling flaw of the proposed Ginnie Mae mortgage bonds as Simon saw them. Whoever bought the bonds was, in one crucial respect, worse off than buyers of corporate and government bonds. He couldn't be certain how long the loan lasted. If an entire neighborhood moved, the bondholder, who had thought he owned a 30-year mortgage bond, found himself sitting on a pile of cash instead. More likely, interest rates fell, and the entire neighborhood refinanced its third-year fixed-rate mortgages at the lower rates. This left the mortgage bondholder holding cash. Cash was no problem if the investor could reinvest it at the same rate of interest as the original loan, or at a higher rate. But if interest rates had fallen, the investor lost out, for his money would not earn the same rate of return as before. Not surprisingly, homeowners prefer to repay their mortgages when interest rates fall, for then they may refinance the house at a lower rate of interest. In other words, money invested in mortgage bonds is normally returned at the worst possible time for the lender. Bill Simon tried to persuade Ginnie Mae to protect the buyer of mortgage bonds. Instead of simply passing whatever cash came from the homeowners through to the bondholders, he argued the pool should be made to simulate a normal bond with a definite maturity. Otherwise, he asked, who would buy the bonds? Who wanted to own a bond of unknown maturity? Who wanted to live with the uncertainty of not knowing when he'd get his money back? When Ginnie Mae ignored the objection, Bill Simon ignored Ginnie Mae. He assigned what is known as Salmon Brothers as a grunt, an analyst in the corporate finance department, to lead the charge on the new mortgage securities market. Grunts don't lead charges. In other words, there would be no charge. Bob Dow spent his day borrowing money to finance Bill Simon's bets in the U.S. government bond market. Dow was effectively trading money. He sought to borrow each day at the cheapest rates and lended at the highest. But he was borrowing and lending for only that one day. He'd come in the next day and start all over again. Trading money, unlike trading bonds, was never fashionable, even within Salmon Brothers. Money was the least volatile commodity traded by Salmon Brothers and therefore the least risky. Trading money was nonetheless trading. It required at least one iron, and the same peculiar logic as bond trading. Witness. One day earlier in his career, Dow was in the market to buy $50 million. He checked around and found the money market was 4 to 4.25%, which meant he could buy at 4.25% or sell at 4%. When he actually tried to buy $50 million at 4.25%, however, the market moved to 4.25 to 4.5%. The seller was scared off by a large buyer. Dow bid 4.5. The market moved again to 4.5 to 4.75%. He raised his bid several more times with the same result, then went to Bill Simon's office to tell him he couldn't buy money. All the sellers were running like chickens. Then you be the seller, said Simon. So Dow became the seller. Although he actually needed to buy, he sold $50 million at 5.5%. He sold another $50 million at 5.5%. Then, as Simon had guessed, the market collapsed. Everyone wanted to sell. There were no buyers. Buy them back now, said Simon when the market reached 4%. So Dow not only get his $50 million at 4%, but took a profit on the money he had sold at higher rates. That was how a Salmon bond trader thought. He forgot whatever it was that he wanted to do for a minute and put his finger on the pulse of the market. If the market felt fidgety, if people were scared or desperate, he herded them like sheep into a corner, and then made them pay for their uncertainty. He sat on the market until it spewed gold coins, and then he worried about what he wanted to do. Bob Dow loved to trade, and though he did not have official responsibility for Ginnie Mae, he began to trade them. Someone had to. Dow established himself as Salomon Brothers' authority on mortgage securities in September 1977. Together with Stephen Joseph, the brother of Drexel CEO Fred Joseph, he created the first private issue of mortgage securities. They persuaded the Bank of America to sell the home loans it had made in the form of bonds. They persuaded investors such as insurance companies to buy the new mortgage bonds. When they did, the Bank of America received the cash it had originally lent the homeowners, which it could then relent. The homeowners continued to write his mortgage payment checks to the Bank of America, but the money was passed on to the Salomon Brothers clients who had purchased the Bank of America bonds. Dow felt sure this was the wave of the future. He thought the boom in demand for housing would outstretch the sources of funding. The population was aging. Few Americans occupied each house. The nation was wealthier. The more people wanted to purchase second homes. Savings and loans could not grow fast enough to make the required loans. He also saw an imbalance in the system caused by the steady drift of people from the Rust Belt to the Sun Belt. Thrifts in the Sun Belt had small deposits and a lot of demand for money from home buyers. Thrifts in the Rust Belt held massive deposits for which they had no demand. Dow saw a solution. Rust Belt thrifts could effectively lend to Sun Belt homeowners by buying the mortgage bonds of Sun Belt thrifts. At the request of the Salomon Brothers Executive Committee, Dow produced a 3-page memo summarizing his belief in the market, which convinced John Gutfreund to remove the trading of Ginnie Mae's from the government bond trading department and establish a mortgage department. It was the spring of 1978. The Gutfreund had just been appointed chairman of the firm by his predecessor, William Salomon, the son of one of the firm's 3 founding fathers. Dow stopped trading money, moved to a seat a few feet away from his old desk, and began to think thoughts years into the future. He realized he needed a financier to negotiate with banks and thrifts, to persuade them to sell their loans as the Bank of America had done. These loans would be transformed into mortgage bonds. The obvious choice for the job was Stephen Joseph, since Joseph had worked closely with Dow on the Bank of America deal. Dow also needed a trader to make markets in the bonds that Joseph created, and that was a bigger problem. The trader was absolutely crucial. The trader bought and sold the bonds. A big-name trader inspired confidence in the investors, and his presence alone could make a market grow. The trader also made the money for Salomon Brothers. Because of this, the trader was the person whom people admired, watched, and attended. Dow had always been the mortgage trader. Now he would be the manager. He had to borrow a proven winner from either the corporate or the government bond trading desks. It presented a problem. At Salomon, if a department allowed someone to leave, it was for the good reason that it wanted to get rid of him. When you took people from other departments, you got only the ones you didn't want. But with the help of John Gutfreund, Dow got his first choice, Lewis Ranieri, a 30-year-old utility bond trader. Ranieri's move to the mortgage department was a seminal event on the eve of the golden age of the bond trader. With his appointment in mid-1978, the story of the mortgage market as it is conventionally told within Salomon Brothers commences. Dow knows precisely why he selected Ranieri. I needed a good, strong trader. Louis was not just a trader, though. He had the mentality and the will to create a market. He was tough-minded. He didn't mind hiding $1 million loss from a manager, if that's what it took. He didn't let morality get in the way. Well, morality is not the right word, but you know what I mean. I have never seen anyone, educated or uneducated, with a quicker mind. And best of all, he was a dreamer. When John Gutfreund told him he would join Dow as head trader in the embryonic mortgage security department, Louis panicked. I was the hottest talent in the corporate department, he says. I didn't understand. The move plucked him from the fray. Utility bonds were making big money, and while it was true a person didn't get paid on commission, one nevertheless climbed through the ranks at Salomon Brothers by pointing to a chunk of money at the end of each year and saying, "That's mine. I did that." Revenues meant power. In Louis' view, there would be no chunk of money at the end of the year in the mortgage department. There would be no more climbing through the ranks. In retrospect, his fears looked laughably absurd. 6 years later, in 1984, on the back of an envelope,
Ranieri would argue plausibly that his mortgage trading department made more money that year than the rest of Wall Street combined in all their businesses. He would swell with pride as he discussed his department's achievements. He would be named vice chairman of Salomon Brothers, second only to Goodfriend. Goodfriend would regularly mention Ranieri as a possible successor, yet Ranieri envisioned none of it in 1978. At the time of his appointment, he felt cheated. I felt like they were saying, "Congratulations, we want to exile you to Siberia." I didn't try to foil the move because that wasn't my style. I just kept asking John, "Why do you want me to do this?" Even after the move, friends came up to ask what I had done to piss off John. Had I lost money or broken the law or what? Like Bill Simon, Ranieri thought mortgages an ugly stepchild of the bond market, who would buy the bonds, who wanted to lend money to a homeowner who would repay at any time. Besides, there wasn't much to trade. There were nothing but a few Ginnie Maes, and nobody cared about those. I tried to figure out what else there was to do.
Ranieri's boyhood ambition had been to become a chef in an Italian kitchen. That ended when a head-on automobile accident on Brooklyn's Snake Hill rekindled an asthmatic condition that didn't tolerate kitchen fumes. He was a sophomore English major at St. John's College when he took a part-time job on a night shift in the Salomon Brothers mailroom in 1968. The Salomon paid check was $70 a week. Several months into his new job, he ran into money problems. He had no financial support from his parents. His wife lay ill in the hospital, and the bills simply accumulated. Ranieri needed $10,000. He was 19 years old, and all he had to his name was his weekly paycheck. He was finally forced to request a loan from the one Salomon Brothers partner he knew vaguely. "You got to remember," he says now, "I was convinced, really convinced, he was going to fire me." Instead, the partner owed Ranieri that the hospital bill would be taken care of. Ranieri thought that meant it would be deducted from his weekly paycheck, which he couldn't afford, and he began to protest. "It will be taken care of," the partner repeated. Salomon Brothers paid the $10,000 bill racked up by the wife of his mailroom clerk with 3 months' tenure. There was no committee meeting to discuss whether this was appropriate. The partner to whom Ranieri had addressed his request hadn't even paused before giving his answer. It was understood that the bill would be paid, for no reason other than it was the right thing to do. One cannot be certain of the exact words spoken by a Salomon Brothers partner long since gone, but it is clear what Ranieri heard. Louis Ranieri would always be taken care of. The act moved Ranieri deeply. When he speaks of loyalty, of the covenant between Salomon Brothers and the people who work for Salomon Brothers, it is that single act of generosity he remembers. From that point on, says one of his mortgage traders, Louis loved the firm. He couldn't understand it was only a business. The firm took care of its people, says Ranieri. There used to be all these expressions like, "It's more important to be a good man than a good manager," and people really meant them. We were a band of brothers. There was, as the people say, a covenant. It sounds sweeter than it was. A man does not get to where Ranieri was simply by being a cuddly bundle of trust and loyalty. "I believe in God, but I'll never be nominated for saint." Ranieri once told a reporter from Esquire magazine, it was not that he lacked values, but he had a keen sense that at times the ends justified the means and an equally keen sense of his own interests. There were signs of tension between him and the corporate bond department. In September 1977, his nemesis, Bill Foote, was made a partner while he was not. Louis went when he was passed over, says Steve Joseph. A former Salomon corporate bond salesman from the 1970s remembers Ranieri as a corporate bond trader and moaning about pay. Louis was sure he wasn't being paid what he was worth to the firm. He said, and I remember his exact words, "If it weren't for the fact that I can do anything I want around here, I'd quit." He was loose, loudmouthed, and brash. Back office staff who worked for Ranieri remember him telling them what to do by screaming at them at the top of their lungs while standing on the top of a desk waving his arms like a referee. Still, he had the charm of wanting to be loved. "I have no enemies," he says, "even my competitors like me, which is amazing considering I never let them get any of the business." When Ranieri came to Salomon Brothers, the mailroom was staffed largely by recent immigrants to America who did not speak English. Among their inefficiencies was the bad habit of placing too much postage on the outgoing mail. His first contribution was to cut costs. That is ironic since he never really cared about costs. He had no time for details. I got the brilliant idea one day to put a map of the US on the wall and outline the postage zones in magic marker. For that, they made me supervisor. He dropped out of St. John's when they made him supervisor of the day shift. Where I came from, it didn't take much to make the kind of decision, he says. From supervisor of the mailroom, he moved out to the clerical back office, which brought him directly in contact with trading and traders. By 1974, he was sitting where he wanted, in a utility bond trader's seat on the corporate bond desk. By 1985, when Matty Oliver hopscotched from Harvard to the training program to the mortgage trading desk, a barrier had arisen between the back office and the front. The process by which one became a trader had become rigidly systematized. You needed a resume. You should have graduated from college. It helped to have gone to business school. It was important to look like an investment banker. In the mid-1970s, this was plainly not the case because Ranieri hadn't finished college, didn't have a resume, and looked about as much like an investment banker as the average Italian chef. He was, in the words of one of his former partners, a fat But it simply did not matter. If somebody quit on the trading floor, they'd look at the nearest body and say, do the job, recalls Tom Kendall, who himself moved out of the back office to trade for Lou Ranieri's mortgage department. A trader would say, hey kid, you're a smart kid, sit here. And if you were an extremely smart kid like Ranieri, you took over. Up to the point of his transfer to the mortgage department, Ranieri had dominated every department he had joined. The firm encouraged both aggression and ability. It made a point never to interfere with natural jungle forces. In a matter of months after his appointment, power over the new mortgage department consolidated in Ranieri's hands. In view of Ranieri's ambition, even Dow concedes a coup was inevitable. Dow fell ill and was often away. In his absence, Ranieri started a research department by asking Michael Waldman, a top mathematician, to join him. The request came, Waldman recalls, in Louis' usual forceful manner. Then Ranieri persuaded the firm to give him a sales force to sell the godforsaken mortgages he was being asked to trade. All of a sudden, a dozen salesmen learned they had to please Lou Ranieri rather than whomever they had been pleasing before. Rich Schuster, who had been a thrift salesman in the Salomon Brothers Chicago office, now found himself a mortgage salesman working for Louis Ranieri. Once I misstyled the commercial paper department and got mortgages instead. Louis happened to answer the phone and immediately realized what had happened. He started to shout at me. What the are you doing selling commercial paper? You are paid to sell mortgages. Salesmen began to focus on mortgages. Steve Joseph was the only other person who conceivably could have replaced Dow, but he was a corporate financier, not a trader. As he says, at Solly at the time, you didn't take a major trading operation and put it under a corporate finance guy. You did, however, take a major financial operation and put it under a trader. So Louis took charge upstairs, too, and came to treat the finance department as an amusing overhead into which even women could be hired. Bob Dow disappeared. Although he didn't leave Salomon until 1984, he found himself out of a job. He was squeezed out by Ranieri months after he had hired him. This sort of thing went on continually at Salomon. The challenger took over by being a little more energetic, a little more popular with clients, a little more influential with colleagues until the man whom he was quietly challenging seemed to evaporate. He became almost quaintly obsolete, like the handle crank on an automobile. Management did not intervene. The loser eventually left. Goodfriend never told me that I'd be replaced by Louis Ranieri, says Dow. I was left hanging there, and it must have taken me 6 months to figure out it wasn't my deal anymore. To this day, Ranieri calls the mortgage securities market Bobby's fishing. In 1984, Dow left to work first for Morgan Stanley and then for Steve Joseph, who had left Salomon for Drexel Burnham. If I didn't believe in the capitalist system, I could never accept what happened, but I do believe in it. The fittest move ahead, Dow told James Sternbull, a reporter from the New York Times, who was trying to discover what had become of the old partners of Salomon Brothers. In February 1979, Goodfriend placed Ranieri officially in charge of the entire mortgage operation. For the next 2.5 years, to everyone except the people inside, the department was more comical than practical. Ranieri created a trading desk in his own image.
Italian, self-educated, loud, and fat. The first traders had their origin, like Louis, in the back office. Among them, there was a single college degree, a BA from Manhattan College. The founding fathers of the mortgage trading desk, in addition to Ranieri, were John Daytona, Peter Merrill, and Manny Alabas. Close on their heels were Bill Esposito and Ron DuPasquale. They went by their first names, Louis, Johnny, Peter, Manny, Billy, and Ronnie. They sounded more like an infield than a team of investment bankers. All that stuff about me in the mailroom is true, says Ranieri. And when I ran mortgages, I religiously took people from the back office. At first, I did it for moral reasons, but it worked. They appreciated it. They didn't feel like the world owed them a living. They were more loyal. But Ranieri also wanted vital young brains from the Salomon training program. So it happened that the desk took its first trainee, who was also its first MBA, first skinny person, and first Jew, Jeffrey Kronthal. Kronthal recalls that he was the only trainee out of the Salomon Brothers training class of 1979 to start his professional life as a clerk. The people placed on other desks were permitted to call themselves salesmen or traders. Kronthal wasn't even head clerk. He was junior clerk under Peter Merrill. As junior clerk, his primary responsibility was to keep track of the bond position run by John Daytona. Kronthal had just graduated from the 5-year Wharton combined undergraduate and MBA program, the closest thing in America to a trade school for finances, and he had more elevated interests than Johnny's positions. This displeased Johnny. Johnny would lean back in his chair and ask, "Jeffrey, what's the position?" Jeffrey would say, "I don't know." Johnny would scream at Louis, "What the is going on? The clerk doesn't know the positions." Louis would scream at Peter, "What the is going on? Your clerk doesn't know the positions." Peter would scream at Jeffrey, "Why don't you know the positions?" And Jeffrey would shrug. It was hard for Kronthal to take any of this seriously for two reasons. First, he knew Louis was fond of him, and Louis was the boss. Kronthal had done Louis a favor by agreeing to join the mortgage department. As Kronthal recalls, members of his training class felt nothing but disdain for the fledgling department. Definitely not the MBA set. Mortgage traders were Donnie Green types, he says. Donnie Green types were traders who made trainees miserable. They were deliberately nasty or rude to anyone who hadn't made the firm a pile of dough. A Donnie Green type wouldn't say hello to you when you tried to sit with him, wouldn't say goodbye when you left, wouldn't look at you while you were there. No trainee ever dared sit next to Donnie Green, says Kronthal. Donnie Green himself had been a trader at Salomon Brothers in the Dark Ages, when traders had more hair on their chests than on their heads. He is remembered as the man who stopped a callow young salesman on his way out the door to catch a flight from New York to Chicago. Green tossed the salesman a $10 bill. "Hey, take out some crash insurance for yourself in my name," he said. "Why?" asked the salesman. "I feel lucky," said Green. No one wanted to get anywhere near the mortgage department, says Kronthal. Even Ranieri admits that Jeffrey's decision to join the mortgage department was regarded as remarkably stupid. So why did Kronthal join? "I looked at it and said, one, I'm 23 years old, and it doesn't matter if it doesn't work out. I don't have to support anything but my own drinking. And two, the firm must have faith in mortgages, or they wouldn't have Louis doing it." Another reason Kronthal wasn't concerned that his many bosses spent so much time screaming at him was that Louis didn't take the clerk's job seriously. Louis used to say that I was the second worst clerk he never knew. The first one was himself, says Kronthal. But there wasn't much for a clerk to do. For that matter, there wasn't much for anyone to do. The mortgage market was the financial equivalent of a ghost town. Nothing moved, nothing traded. It meant that they made no money. To get bonds to trade, Louis realized he needed to hit the road and persuade Salomon's customers to play. He would have to be the promoter of the casino and usher people in. But to free himself from the trading desk, Louis needed to find a head of trading. He made a hasty search and came up with Mario, a small but amusing error in judgment, perhaps not his first, certainly not his last. Mario came from Merrill Lynch. He knew nothing, says Samuel Sachs, who joined the mortgage department as a salesman in 1979. While all the other traders were slobs, Mario wore a 3-piece polyester suit with a gold watch chain dangling down in front. Very slick. Every hair was in place, says Sachs. He'd lean across to Louis and ask, "How do you like him, Louis?" Louis would say, "I like him a lot." And Mario would say, "Yeah, I like him too, I like him too." 15 minutes later, he'd lean across again to Louis and ask, "How do you like him now, Louis?" Louis would say, "Don't like him at all." And Mario would say, "I don't like him neither. I don't like him neither." Mario lasted about 9 months in Salomon Brothers as the new head of mortgage trading. There was still a perceived need for a head of trading. In May 1980, Michael Matara was recalled from the London office, where he had been a trader, to fill the void left by Mario's departure. One of his former London colleagues recalls Matara with his bags packed and a forlorn look, saying he didn't have any idea what he was going back to. Matara claims now that he knew exactly what he was going back to, but he could not have been very pleased with it. After a year of making no money and being the butt of ridicule within Salomon Brothers, mortgage trading looked doomed. A rift was growing between the small group of uneducated Italians and the rest of the firm. The mortgage traders deeply resented the corporate and government traders. Partly it was a money problem. The Salomon compensation game, like the job placement game for trainees, has a political wildcard in it. Year-end bonuses are not tied directly to one's profitability, but rather to the perception of one's value by the Salomon Brothers Compensation Committee. At the end of the year, bonuses are highly subjective, and a well-placed friend can be as helpful as a good year's trading. The mortgage department had neither friends nor profits. "I couldn't get my people paid," said Louis. "They were regarded as second-rate. We were the black sheep squadron." What really stung the traders, however, was not their absolute level of pay, but their pay in relation to the other bond traders. "You got the sense the firm was doing you a favor," says former mortgage trader Tom Kendall. "Ask the guys," says Ranieri. "They'll tell you that the corporate trader got paid twice as much as them. Bonus numbers were supposed to be a management secret. A trader wasn't supposed to know the size of his neighbor's bonus." Right. A big bonus was about as well concealed on the Salomon Brothers trading floor as the result of a hot date in the high school boys' locker room. It took about an hour for a trader to discover what everyone else was paid. Had the source of the rift between the mortgage traders and the rest of the bond traders been money alone, however, it might eventually have been repaired, but there was a widening cultural gap between the two. In the late 1970s, Jim Massey, the architect of Salomon's recruitment policy, decided that Salomon needed to upgrade its personnel. He came to the conclusion that we couldn't have a bunch of schleps from Podang U on the trading floor, says Scott Brittenham. Brittenham worked as a recruiter for Massey in 1980 before moving on to trade mortgages. Salomon Brothers began to resemble the rest of Wall Street. It recruited the same MBAs as Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley. The effect was as much social as it was intellectual. Like the Goldmans, the Sachses, the Lehmans, the Kuhns, and the Lopes before them, the Salomons were feeling the pull of what the writer Stephen Birmingham called our crowd, though we weren't quite to the stage of building new wings onto the Metropolitan Museum. The firm had always been run by Jews. It came to be controlled by a contingent of WASPs, wannabe WASPs, and social climbers. The facelift coincided with the sales of the firm to the commodities dealer Phillips Brothers in 1981. Salomon ceased to be a partnership and became a corporation. The average partner received a lump sum of $7.8 million from the sale. It was as if they said all at once, "We have our money now. What next? An empire, class, weekends in Paris, nights at St. James's Palace." The mortgage department had a far richer and earthier culture to protect than did either governments or corporates. While the rest of the firm gradually acquired a new personnel, mortgages remained more transiently the same. Ranieri welded a coherent departmental personality out of two separate but equally gamey ethnic groups. Nearly all the traders came from one of two backgrounds. They were the Italians who started the department, and there were the Jews with MBAs who joined fresh from the training program. I'm not sure any of them had what you'd call genuine ethnic identity, but they were an oppressed minority, and they shed rather than acquired heirs. They were back row people to a man. By outside standards, the mortgage trading department was highly discriminatory. Few blacks and Orientals, no women. Next to the rest of the firm, however, the mortgage department looked like the United Nations. The photographs from Salomon Brothers' annual reports tell a tale in themselves. Those from the late 1970s look like advertisement for world peace. Picture after picture contains obligatory mixture of black, yellow, and white people, men and women, working in peaceful harmony in shiny conference tables. By the mid-80s, however, all things black, yellow, and female have disappeared from the photographs. There isn't a trace of anything but white men in the annual reports. The mortgage department became a white brotherhood apart. The tacit agreement was that Louis would do everything he could to get his traders paid, and his traders would be loyal to Louis. Their confidence was weaker than Ranieri's. The traders had come from business school rather than the mailroom. Many of them were financially independent. It was hard for Ranieri to do favors. Ranieri liked to be surrounded by people he could do things for. He liked people, but he especially liked the concept of his people. He would have thriven on a steady stream of traders with medical bills they couldn't meet. When Bill Esposito fell short $19,000 on the house he wanted to buy, Ranieri had Solomon make up the difference. He was apologetic he couldn't make it to me out of his own pocket, says Esposito. Still, people responded. In 1979, Tom Kendall joined the desk from Wharton with a brief intervening stop in the back office. In 1980, Mason Holt, a fraternity brother of Cronthall's from Wharton, and Steve Roth from Stanford signed up. In 1981, Andy Stone and Wolf Needleman from Harvard came on board. They viewed themselves in relation to the rest of the firm in much the same way as Louis. As Needleman says, while Tom Strauss and his crowd wore Hermes ties and ran triathlons, Louis' people were an Italian family. While the government department ate tofu and wore pleated pants, the attitude in the mortgage department was, "What do you mean you only had 2 servings? Didn't you like it? Did you ever see a fat government trader? Of course not. They were lean and mean. They discriminated against fat people. Look, I know what I'm talking about. I'm fat." It was clear that the rest of the firm tolerated us without approval, says Tom Kendall. They'd ask, what do those yo-brains over there in the corner do for a living? One of Andy Stone's most vivid memories as a trainee is of pointing in the direction of Ranieri and Co. and asking a corporate bond trader who they were. Nobody, said the trader. Mortgages. They're a nothing department. Nobody wants to be in mortgages. Craig Coates, the head of government trading at Solomon, asked Stone, why would you possibly want to be in mortgages when you can be in governments? Even at higher levels, the fat people thought the skinny people had it in for them. The firm, says former managing director Mortara, was a bunch of fiefdoms. People in the other departments were more concerned with protecting their own business than with developing this new business. The resentment the mortgage department felt toward those in power increased when it became known in early 1980 that those outside the department wanted it shut down. The mortgage department wasn't making money. The other mortgage units on Wall Street, Merrill Lynch, First Boston, Goldman Sachs, were still born. They closed almost before they had opened. The prevailing wisdom was that mortgages were not for Wall Street. The business was reeling from what appeared to have been the knockout punch. Paul Volcker had made his historic speech on October 6, 1979. Short-term interest rates had skyrocketed. For a thrift manager to make a 30-year home loan, he had to accept a rate of interest of 10%. Meanwhile, to get the money, he was paying 12%. He ceased, therefore, to make new loans, which suited the purpose of the Federal Reserve, which was trying to slow the economy. New housing starts dropped to post-war lows. Before Volcker's speech, Steve Joseph's mortgage finance department had created roughly $2 billion in mortgage securities. It was a laughably small amount, less than 0.2% of outstanding American home mortgages. But it was a start. After Volcker's speech, the deals dropped. For Ranieri and Co. to create bonds, the thrifts had to want to make loans. They didn't. The industry that held most of America's home mortgages on its books was collapsing. In 1980, there were 4,002 savings and loans in America. Over the next 3 years, 962 of those would collapse. As Tom Kendall put it, everybody hunkered down and licked their wounds. Everybody but Ranieri. Ranieri expanded. Why? Who knows? Perhaps he had a crystal ball. Perhaps he figured that the larger his department grew, the harder it would be to dismantle. For whatever reason, Ranieri hired the fired mortgage salesmen from other firms, built his research department, doubled the number of traders, and left the dormant mortgage finance department in place. He hired a phalanx of lawyers and lobbyists in Washington to work on legislation to increase the number of potential buyers of mortgage securities. I'll tell you a fact, says Ranieri. The Bank of America deal was a legal investment in only 3 states. I had a team of lawyers trying to change the law on a state-by-state basis. It would have taken 2,000 years. That's why I went to Washington, to go over the heads of the states. If Louis didn't like a law, he'd just have it changed, explains one of his traders. Even if Ranieri had secured a change in the law, however, investors would have stayed clear of mortgage bonds. Tom Kendall remembered visiting Ranieri's top salesman, Rick Borden, in Salomon Brothers' San Francisco office in 1979. Borden was reading a self-help book. I remember him saying over and over, these GD may suck. They get longer when rates go up and shorter when rates go down, and nobody wants them, says Kendall. To make matters worse, the Salomon Brothers Credit Committee was growing reluctant to deal with the collapsing savings and loans industry. Stupid customers were a wonderful asset, but at some level of ignorance, they became a liability. They went broke. And somehow, thrifts weren't like normal stupid customers. One thrift in California, Beneficial Standard, reneged on the purchase of bonds from Salomon that had been confirmed, as are all bond traders by phone. The thrift claimed in the subsequent lawsuit that the mortgage bond business should be governed by real estate law rather than securities law, and that the real estate law and oral contract wasn't binding. This very nearly was the final straw. The executive committee members of Salomon Brothers decided the mortgage market was bad news. They didn't understand it. They didn't want to understand it. They just wanted out of it. They planned to start by severing ties with the thrift industry. The entire thrift industry looked shaky. Lines of credit were to be cut. Cutting off thrifts was the same as cutting down the mortgage department, since thrifts were the only buyers of mortgage bonds. I basically threw my body between the credit committee and the thrift industry, says Dewey. In all his decisions, Ranieri had the support of only one man on the Salomon Brothers Executive Committee, but he was the important vote, John Goodfriend. John protected me, says Ranieri. The upshot of the hostilities between the mortgage department and the two real powers of Salomon, corporate and government bond trading, was that everything in the mortgage department was separate. Mortgage sales, mortgage finance, mortgage research, mortgage operations, and mortgage trading. The reason everything was separate is that no one would help us, says Ranieri. It was slightly more complicated than that, however. To a degree, they were separate by choice. Ranieri didn't exactly go out of his way to build bridges to the rest of the firm, and Bob Dow had insisted in his original 3-page memo to the Salomon Executive Committee that the mortgage department stand alone. He remembered the way the old boss, Bill Simon, had treated the first mortgage securities. If the mortgage department were forced to work with the government department, he said, the mortgage market would never get off the ground. It would be subjugated. If the few financiers at Salomon Brothers, whose job it was to call on the CEOs of large corporations, were given mortgage finance, they would never have done the deals. Corporate finance people feel mortgage deals are beneath them, Dow explained. But in Ranieri's mind, the mortgage department stood alone for the very simple reason that it had no friends. He built high walls to protect his people from hostile forces. The enemy was no longer his Wall Street competitors, for they had mostly disappeared. The enemy was Salomon Brothers. The irony, says Ranieri, is that the firm would always point to the mortgage department and say, look, see how innovative we are. But the truth is that the firm said no to everything we did. This department got built in spite of the firm, not because of the firm. 好，咁啊睇到呢一節咧就詳細咁樣講咗呢個 mortgage department 啦，由呢個 Ranieri 所帶領嘅 mortgage department 喺 Salomon Brothers 嘅地位啦，佢哋所揾嘅錢啦，帶嚟嘅影響，亦都同呢個傳統嘅政府債券啊、公司債券啊呢個最大部門啦，形成咗即係一個對立面啦嚇，大家有一個權力嘅鬥爭啦，亦都係屬於良性嘅，可以咁講，都係為公司帶嚟咗好多利潤。好，我哋睇下有邊幾個字同大家分享啊 ？Plum 呢個常用 ，plum 喺呢度就係一個 informal 嘅形容詞 ，informal a thing typically a job considered to be highly desirable a plum job。書入面有提到 a plum job 係好值得擁有嘅一份好工嚟 plum job。Ornery 都係 informal 嘅形容詞，尤其是喺北美用嘅 bad-tempered or difficult to deal with Ornery， 脾氣唔好嘅，中意爭吵嘅。咁當然係形容 Salomon Brothers 入面嘅 traders 啦。呢個要同大家分享啊。Thrift 係一個名詞，但係美國人會咁用嘅啫。我唔知英國今時今日會唔會都會咁用嘅。喺美國咧 ，Thrift 呢個名詞嘅意思係 savings and loan， 一個儲蓄或者借貸啦，或者形容一個儲蓄銀行咁樣嘅意思。好，我哋今次到嚟呢度，下一次仲同大家見面，拜拜。